I had always dreamed of having a home with a small patch of earth I could truly call my own. Nothing grand, nothing flashy, just a front yard where I could plant roses. My grandmother raised me on stories about her rose garden, and she used to say, "A rose isn't just a flower. It's proof that something beautiful can grow even when life gives you thorns." So, the moment my family moved into our new suburban neighborhood, the very first thing I did wasn't unpack boxes, it was planting. I worked late into the evenings, turning dull patches of dirt into living soil. Day by day, bush by bush, I nurtured my rose garden into something that glowed with color. Neighbors would stop during their evening walks, smiling, pointing, even snapping photos. "Your roses make the whole street look alive," one woman told me. Children leaned over to smell them on their way to school. For once, I felt like I was giving something to the community, not just existing in it. But then, the letter came. The envelope had that unmistakable HOA logo on it, the one that makes your stomach twist. Inside, the words were cold, formal, and merciless. "You are in violation of HOA landscaping policy. Remove your rose bushes immediately or face fines." I stared at the letter for hours. My heart pounded in my chest. Remove my roses? My roses? The very soul of my home? I thought it had to be a mistake. Surely, no one in their right mind would want to destroy something so harmless, so beautiful. But when I showed the letter to my neighbor, she sighed and whispered. "They did the same thing to me when I planted sunflowers. The HOA doesn't like anything they can't control." That night, I walked through my garden with a flashlight. The roses seemed to whisper back at me, swaying gently in the breeze, as if they knew their existence was suddenly under threat. And that was when something inside me hardened. I wasn't going to let them take this from me. What I didn't know was that this fight would lead me into a battle bigger than I ever imagined. A battle that would change not just my life, but the neighborhood's future. And it all began with a single rose. Asterisk. It was a Tuesday morning when I found it. A plain white envelope tucked neatly under my doormat, with bold letters on the front. Homeowners Association compliance violation. I froze. My stomach twisted. I had paid my dues, kept my lawn trimmed, painted my shutters exactly the color they approved. What could they possibly want this time? I opened it slowly, my hands trembling. The letter inside was written with cold formality. "Your front yard rose garden violates HOA landscaping guidelines. You are hereby required to remove the rose bush within 14 days or face a fine of $100 per day until compliance is met." My rose garden? My pride, my sanctuary, the one place that felt like mine in this cookie-cutter neighborhood. I had planted every bush with care. Each one had a story. The white roses from my late mother's garden. The red climbing roses my daughter picked out for her birthday. Asterisk. The delicate pink ones I planted on the day we moved into this house, hoping it would be our forever home. Asterisk. And now the HOAs wanted them gone. Asterisk, asterisk. That evening, I sat on the porch staring at my flowers. The sunset lit them up in golden hues, the fragrance drifting through the air. I thought about how many times neighbors had stopped to admire them, how kids walking home from school always paused to smell them. This wasn't just a garden. It was a piece of me, and in that moment, something shifted. I realized the HOA wasn't just attacking my roses. They were testing my will. But what can I do? I had 2 weeks to either destroy the heart of my home or find another way. I didn't know it yet, that this was the spark that would turn my quiet suburban life into a battle, and later into a business that not even the HOA could touch. Asterisk at. First, my plan seemed bulletproof. Customers stopped by regularly. My little rose stand drew smiles from neighbors, and for the first time in months, I felt free. I was no longer the homeowner cowering behind warning letters. I was a proud gardener, standing behind my table of roses, earning a bit of extra cash, and finally reclaiming my dignity. But the HOO wasn't done with me. Not even close. One Thursday morning, while arranging freshly cut roses into mason jars, I saw 3 board members walking toward my yard, clipboards in hand. They didn't look curious. They looked like predators circling prey. "Mr. Stevens," one of them called out, his tone sharp. "We need to talk about this operation." I smiled, keeping my voice calm. "You mean my rose stand?" His eyes narrowed. "This isn't a stand. This is a violation. You've turned your front yard into a commercial enterprise. That's against community policy." Inside, my chest tightened, but I didn't let them see. Instead, I leaned against the table and gestured to the roses. "These are my personal flowers from my personal garden. I'm not running a business. I'm simply sharing them. Neighbors donate what they wish. That's not commerce. That's kindness." The other board member scribbled something on her clipboard, her lips pursed. "We'll have to review this," she muttered. But their glares told me everything. They weren't going to let this go. That night, an official letter appeared in my mailbox. The HOA accused me of violating multiple rules: unauthorized signage, excessive foot traffic, and failure to maintain aesthetic harmony. They gave me 7 days to shut it all down. 7 days. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the letter. My wife looked at me with worry in her eyes. "They're never going to stop, are they?" she whispered. I shook my head. "No, but I'm not stopping either." Because what the HOA didn't know was that I had already been preparing my next move. A move so clever, so untouchable, it would push them into a corner. And this time, it wouldn't just protect my roses, it would expose them. What secret plan could force an HOA, an organization built on rules and intimidation, to back down? And could a simple rose garden really be powerful enough to change the entire community? Asterisk, I spent nights combing through the HOA handbook, line by line, page by page. Most people would have thrown it in a drawer and forgotten about it. But I was determined to find something they had overlooked. And then I found it, buried deep in the landscaping section. Under approved use of property was a small, almost unnoticeable clause. Residents may maintain gardens for the purpose of agricultural use, provided they do not obstruct community walkways or shared property. That one line lit a fire in me. Roses weren't just flowers. They were agriculture too. People make rose water, rose oil, rose tea, even edible decorations. If I could frame my rose garden as an agricultural project, the HOA wouldn't be able to touch it. The next morning, I got to work. I began researching small businesses that use roses. Asterisk, I learned how rose petals could be dried and sold. I found online stores that made soaps, oils, and even herbal teas from roses. Suddenly, my rose garden wasn't just a garden anymore. It was the foundation of a business. I filed for a small business license under the name Everbloom Naturals. On paper, my roses were now agricultural crops. And according to the very handbook the HOA loved to wave in my face, I had every right to keep them. When the HOA sent me another violation letter demanding that I remove my rose bush, I didn't panic this time. Instead, I calmly attached my business registration documents and mailed them back with a polite note. According to Section 4, Subclause 12 of the HOA Handbook, residents are permitted to maintain gardens for agricultural purposes. I am now cultivating roses for commercial agricultural use. Therefore, my garden is fully compliant. The silence that followed was delicious. For the first time, the HOA didn't know what to do. They couldn't find me, they couldn't threaten me, and they definitely couldn't force me to dig up my roses. But this was only the beginning. I wasn't just going to save my rose garden. I was going to turn it into something bigger then. The HOA ever imagined ... just when I thought my rose garden business was finally untouchable. The HOA came knocking again. At first, their attempts were small snide letters slipped into my mailbox about unauthorized foot traffic in the neighborhood, and warnings about commercial activity not suitable for residential zones. But this time, they were organized. The president of the HOA called a special meeting, and my rose garden was the only topic on the agenda. I showed up, sitting quietly in the back, as they hurled accusations. Your garden has become a commercial marketplace. The delivery trucks are disrupting our peaceful streets. This is not in the spirit of our community. What they didn't expect was that my neighbors had started to love what I was doing. Some of them were my best customers, picking up bouquets for anniversaries, birthdays, and even funerals. When the board tried to pass a motion to shut me down, a few brave neighbors stood up. Mrs. Klein, who had lived there for 30 years, said, "These roses brought life back into this street. Instead of lifeless lawns, we finally have color, beauty, and joy. Why would you want to destroy that?" The room went quiet. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about me versus the HOA anymore. It had become the community versus the HOA's obsession with control. Still, the board didn't back down. They doubled their efforts. I started receiving fines every week, one for unauthorized signage, another for too many visitors, even one for excessive fragrance. Yes, they actually fined me because my roses smelled too strong. It was laughable, but it was also stressful. Every envelope I opened felt like another attack. And yet, each fine only made me more determined, because by now, my roses weren't just flowers. They had become a statement of resistance. Asterisk. The HOA thought they had cornered me. Letters, fines, warnings. They believed I'd eventually cave and rip out the roses and bow to their rules. But they didn't know one thing. I had been reading the HOA bylaws like a lawyer preparing for trial. And then, I found it, buried deep in Section 14. Clause 7 of the HOA handbook was a peculiar line. HOA restrictions do not extend to flora used for commerce or business purposes, provided the business is registered and does not cause disturbance to the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was meaningless legal fluff. But then it clicked. If my rose garden was officially part of a registered business, then it wouldn't fall under HOA landscaping restrictions. Suddenly, their biggest weapon against me turned into their biggest blind spot. I immediately registered a small business under my name, Roseland Blooms, Organic Roses and Handmade Goods. Now, my front yard roses weren't just for show. They were legally part of my business inventory. The next HOA meeting was legendary. The president stood up, all smug, saying, "We've given you ample warnings. Remove the rose garden, or the fines will continue." I calmly pulled out my business registration documents and placed them on the table. "Actually," I said, trying not to smile, "these roses are not just part of my home. They're part of my business. And according to your own bylaws, you cannot restrict commercial flora." The room went dead silent. One board member's face turned pale. Another started flipping through the handbook, desperately searching for a rebuttal. But the clause was there, plain as day. The president muttered, This isn't what the rule was meant for." I leaned in and replied, "Maybe not, but it's how the rule is written." For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. I wasn't just a homeowner fighting against their demands. I was a business owner operating within my legal rights. And just like that, the roses were untouchable. But that was only the beginning. Because once my neighbors saw how I had turned the HOA's rules against them, they started asking me questions. "Can you sell bouquets? Can I buy rose oil? Could you help me set up my own garden?" What started as a simple rebellion was about to blossom into something much bigger. Asterisk. Word of Emma's fight against the HOA spread quickly, especially after she shared her story in a few local gardening groups and community forums. To her surprise, dozens of neighbors who had quietly faced similar harassment from the HOA reached out to her. Some had been fined for planting sunflowers. Others had been told to remove bird feeders or decorative lights. One elderly couple had even been forced to cut down a small vegetable patch that provided them with fresh food. Emma realized that she wasn't alone. Her rose garden had become a symbol of resistance. One Saturday morning, her driveway was filled with people carrying plants, flowers, and signs. Support Emma's garden, read one banner. Neighbors brought snacks, kids painted little posters, and local musicians played cheerful tunes. What began as a small act of defiance transformed into a block-wide garden festival. The HOA board members, watching from afar, were visibly uncomfortable. They had expected Emma to fold under pressure, but instead, she had created something that unified the community. Soon after, local news stations picked up the story. Reporters showed up to film her flourishing rose business and the neighborhood rally. Headlines read, "Local woman turns HOA fine into flower power," and "How one rose garden sparked a community movement." Emma didn't just have a garden. Anymore, she had a platform, a business, and most importantly, a supportive community that the HOA could no longer silence. Asterisk. Word about my rose garden business spread fast. By now, half the neighborhood had walked through my front yard at least once, either to buy flowers, take pictures, or just smell the roses. What started as a hobby had turned into a full-fledged side hustle. But of course, the HOA wasn't going to let me enjoy this in peace. One evening, I got another letter in the mail. This time, it wasn't just about violations. It was a formal notice signed by HOA President Linda Thompson and two other board members, Greg Miller and Susan Carter. The letter claimed that I was running a commercial operation in a residential neighborhood, increasing traffic and disrupting community peace, violating aesthetic uniformity with my rose displays. And the kicker? They demanded I cease operations immediately or face a $250 per day fine. I almost laughed when I read it. Susan Carter, one of the board members, lived across the street from me. She was the type who kept her blinds half open just so she could spy on people. She had complained about kids riding bikes too fast, dogs barking, and even someone's mailbox color. Of course, she hated the attention my rose garden was getting. That night, my friend and neighbor Mike Anderson stopped by. Mike was a laid-back guy, a single dad who lived 2 doors down. He had been one of my first flower customers, buying roses for his daughter's dance recital. "Man," Mike said, holding the letter in his hand, "they're scared. That's all this is. You've got something good going, and they can't stand not having control." He was right. The HOA didn't care about traffic or aesthetics. They cared about power. And I had taken some of that power away just by planting roses. So I came up with a new plan. The next morning, I announced on social media, Rose Garden Saturdays, a free, once-a-week community event. No sales, just people enjoying the garden, taking pictures, and maybe leaving a donation if they wanted. This way, I wasn't running a business. I was hosting a community gathering. And the response? Massive. Families showed up. Couples came for date photos. Even local photographers started tagging my house on Instagram. The HOA board members watched from their porches, fuming as more and more people showed up with smiles, cameras, and picnic blankets. Linda Thompson even stormed down my driveway one Saturday, demanding to know what was going on. I just smiled and said, "It's not a business, Linda. It's a community activity. Everyone's welcome." The crowd around me clapped and cheered, and for the first time, The HOA realized this wasn't just me versus them anymore. The entire neighborhood was getting involved. Asterisk. The success of Lily's rose-inspired business had spread like wildfire throughout the community. Neighbors who once whispered about her rule-breaking garden were now proudly bragging about living next to the Rose Lady. Local news outlets even ran features on how one woman turned HOA oppression into an entrepreneurial victory. And that's exactly what drove the HOA board into panic mode. At their next meeting, the president of the HOA, Mr. Carter, slammed his fist on the table. This is getting out of hand. She's making money off common property aesthetics. Our HOA name's being dragged into the news like we're the villains here. Another board member nervously adjusted her glasses. Well, technically, we kind of are. People love our garden. If we push too hard, it could backfire. But Carter wasn't listening. The man had built his entire identity around controlling the neighborhood. He thrived on power, and Lily's growing fame was a threat. So the HOA did what HOAs often do. When they start losing control, they got creative with the rules. A week later, Lily received another thick envelope. This time, the HOA accused her of operating a commercial business from her residence without HOA approval, changing the community aesthetic by attracting outsiders who came to buy her rose products, and the most ridiculous claim of all, disturbing neighborhood harmony. It was laughable. The HOA, which had claimed her roses were against regulations, was now admitting that they were so popular they were disturbing the peace. But Lily didn't laugh. She knew this wasn't just about fines anymore. It was about the HOA trying to crush her spirit. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, reading through the accusations while her friend and neighbor Sarah sipped coffee across from her. "This isn't about the roses anymore," Sarah said firmly. "This is about Carter. He can't stand that a single homeowner is outshining the HOA." Lily nodded. "Then it's time I stop playing defense and go on the offense." The Homeowners Association wasn't ready to surrender. Their pride had been wounded, their authority challenged. They launched a final campaign of intimidation, letters stamped with red ink, claiming violations of community harmony, threats of heavy daily fines. Even rumors spread in the neighborhood that the roses were attracting pests and bringing down property values. But this time, things were different. The main character wasn't the same quiet homeowner anymore. The rose business had grown so much that it wasn't just a hobby. It was now an officially registered small business, with permits, legal protection, and even tax contributions. The state recognized it. The city welcomed it. And the neighbors? They weren't whispering complaints anymore. They were lining up with petitions in hand, signing their names in bold ink. "We support the Rose Garden. We support this business. We support our neighbor." Even local news stations caught wind of the battle. A reporter stood outside the yard one morning, microphone in hand, saying, "What started as a fight over flowers has now become a symbol of community resistance against rigid control." The HOA panicked. They called an emergency board meeting, faces tense under the fluorescent lights of the community hall. But no matter what schemes they discussed, one truth was clear. The roses weren't going anywhere. The more they attacked, the stronger the story spread. Every move they made turned into free publicity for the rose business. For the first time, the HOA felt powerless. Their rules, once feared, now looked like chains trying to cage beauty. And the community was no longer on their side. The roses had won hearts, and no bylaw could fight that. Asterisk. The night before the HOA special meeting, I could barely sleep. The rose shop was running smoothly. Neighbors were showing their support, and even local media had covered my story. But tomorrow was different. Tomorrow, the HOA would finally decide whether to shut me down once and for all. When I walked into the community hall the next evening, the air was thick with tension. The room was packed, not just with HOA board members and residents, but also with curious neighbors, supporters, and even a local reporter with a camera. The president of the HOA, Linda Graves, sat at the front table with her usual tight-lipped smile. "Tonight, we will address the matter of Mr. Carter's unauthorized rose business," she announced coldly. I stood up, clutching a folder full of documents. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to speak clearly. "First, let me say this. I never set out to break any rules. I planted roses in my yard because I love them. When the HOA demanded I remove them, I found a way to share them instead. And guess what? People love them too." A murmur ran through the room. Some residents nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. Linda shot me a glare. "The bylaws clearly state that residents may not run businesses out of their homes. Your so-called shop is in direct violation." I flipped open my folder and pulled out a copy of the bylaws. "Actually," I said with a steady voice, "the rules forbid retail shops inside the home. But I'm not selling from inside. I'm simply growing roses in my yard and delivering them. That makes me an independent vendor, which is not against." "Oh, a policy." Gasps erupted from the audience. Even the board members exchanged nervous glances. Linda leaned forward. "You're exploiting a loophole." "Or maybe," I countered, "I'm just using creativity to bring something positive to this neighborhood. Instead of tearing down beauty, I've built something people enjoy." You tried to stop me, but I adapted. That's what community should be about: growth, not control. The room broke into applause. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the momentum shift in my favor. But Linda wasn't finished. She slammed her gavel. "Order. This isn't a popularity contest. The board will vote." As the members whispered among themselves, I caught sight of something that made me smile. Dozens of neighbors, holding small rose bouquets they had bought from me earlier that week. They weren't just showing support with words. They had come armed with proof that my roses had already become part of their lives. And in that moment, I realized, no matter how the board voted tonight, I had already won something much bigger than a legal argument. Asterisk. The success of Roseland Creations spread beyond the neighborhood, beyond the town, and eventually across the state. What had once been a petty a dispute had transformed into a business that touched thousands of lives. Emma was now shipping rose-themed gift boxes nationwide. From Texas to California, New York to Florida, homes were receiving the fragrance and beauty of her roses. Every box carried a small card that read, "More from a garden they tried to take away. These roses now bloom freely for everyone." The message struck a chord. Customers weren't just buying roses. They were buying resilience, freedom, and beauty that no HOA or board could suppress. Emma also began hosting weekend workshops in her converted garage studio. Mothers brought their daughters, young couples came for date nights. Retirees came to rediscover a forgotten passion. What started as one woman's stand against unfair rules had blossomed into a community movement. Even local schools began inviting her to talk about entrepreneurship, resilience, and creativity. Standing in front of students, Emma would say, "Never let anyone dictate the limits of your dreams. If someone shuts one door, build another. And sometimes plant a rosebush right in front of it." The irony? Some HOA board members, the very ones who had once tried to uproot her roses, secretly bought her products online. They couldn't resist the beauty. Emma knew it, and it made her smile every time she saw an order from a familiar address. Her roses had found their way into weddings, anniversaries, graduations, and even hospital rooms where they brought comfort to patients. She had gone from being the stubborn neighbor with too many flowers to being the rose lady whose name was known and admired far beyond her cul-de-sac. And in the quiet evenings, when she walked through her blooming backyard, Emma often thought, they wanted to take away my garden. Instead, they gave me a story, one that keeps blooming every single day. The day of the final HOA hearing arrived. By this point, my small home-based rose venture wasn't so small anymore. I had neighborhood kids helping me package soaks, a local cafe ordering rose teas in bulk, and even a boutique shop in town showcasing my rose-based skincare line. The garden problem had blossomed into a community-supported business. Inside the HOA meeting room, the board members looked uneasy. Their binders of complaints seemed outdated compared to the stack of community testimonials I carried. People from the neighborhood showed up, too, some who had bought products, others who just loved the way the garden made our street smell like spring year-round. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't just defend my right to keep my roses. I presented evidence of how my garden had become an asset to the neighborhood. Property values hadn't dropped. In fact, a realtor testified that houses near my street were selling faster because of the charm. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that I was running a business from home, violating community rules, but I was ready. I showed that my products were made in a licensed facility downtown, a partner kitchen I rented after demand grew. My house was nothing more than the source of the roses. Legally, they had no grounds. The room was silent as the board voted. One by one, the members reluctantly admitted defeat. The HOA president cleared his throat and announced, "The board has decided that no action will be taken against your garden." I smiled, but not just for me, for every neighbor who stood with me, for every person who believed that beauty and community mattered more than rules written in ink decades ago. Walking out of that meeting, I realized something bigger. This wasn't just about roses anymore. It was about proving that sometimes what starts as a fight against unfairness can grow into something far more meaningful.